Diana Lewis could hardly keep her eyes open as she navigated the dark, winding roads of a town she barely knew. The rain hammered against her windshield, the wipers barely keeping up with the relentless downpour, and each swipe seemed to blur her vision more than it cleared it. After hours of grueling paperwork, uncooperative witnesses, and unrelenting deadlines, she craved nothing more than her warm bed. She could practically feel the weight of her fatigue in her bones, and the silence of the isolated road felt like a strange comfort. Yet, the darkness seemed to cling too close to her car, and the occasional flash of lightning only intensified the eerie solitude around her. It was in that sudden flash of white that she first noticed the headlights in her rearview mirror. They came out of nowhere, piercing through the rain and creeping up from behind, cutting through her momentary calm. The police car's headlights remained steady, and as the minutes passed, she felt a slow tension building in her chest. Every so often, the headlights would disappear, only to reappear as if the car was purposefully lingering just far enough back, letting her know she was being watched. Diana's pulse quickened. It was a small, unassuming town, and she'd already caught a few wary stares from locals when she'd stopped for gas earlier in the day. There was something unsettling about the whole situation, but she knew that encounters with local police could be unpredictable, especially in places where strangers, especially those who looked like her, were met with suspicion. Her FBI badge sat in her bag, a silent reminder of her authority and protection, but she also knew that revealing it could raise eyebrows and add layers to an already tense encounter. In this dimly lit, rain-soaked night, she didn't want any additional complications, especially not on her way home. Diana tried to shake off the feeling of dread that was settling in. Maybe the officer was just following out of routine patrol. Maybe he'd turn off and go about his business. But as the miles ticked by, the police car remained firmly in her rearview mirror. Then, the sudden flash of red and blue lights broke through the rain, and she felt her heart sink. She knew there was no escaping this encounter. She slowed her car, pulling to the side of the road, rain cascading down her windows as she came to a halt, the world outside drowned by the unending torrent. With her hands firmly gripping the steering wheel, she watched through her side mirror as the officer approached. The raincoat barely covered his head, leaving water to drip down his face, but it did nothing to soften his expression. His gaze was hard and unrelenting, as if he'd already judged and convicted her in his mind. Officer Liam Carter was a tall, stocky man with an air of authority that seemed to ooze off him. His strides were slow and deliberate, each step calculated, as though he were mentally preparing himself for a confrontation. As he reached her window, Diana rolled it down just enough to hear him over the rain but kept it raised high enough to create a barrier, small though it was. Without so much as a polite greeting, Carter cut straight to the point. "License and registration," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. His eyes moved over her, studying her face, her hair, her hands on the wheel, each part of her under silent scrutiny. Diana handed over her documents without a word, her calm demeanor unbroken. She'd been trained to remain composed under pressure, and she knew that keeping her emotions in check was crucial. Carter's gaze lingered a moment too long on her name, his lips curling slightly as he looked back up at her. "Where are you headed, Miss Lewis?" "Just heading home," Diana replied, keeping her voice steady, not offering any more information than necessary. She didn't owe him an explanation for every movement she made, and she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeming rattled. But Carter's tone sharpened as he questioned her further, his skepticism apparent. "Driving this late, in a town you're not from?" He leaned closer, his gaze heavy with suspicion as if trying to draw a confession from her. "Why here?" Diana could feel her patience wearing thin, but she held back. She knew exactly what this was, a power play. He was trying to intimidate her, make her feel small. Every interaction, every word he spoke, carried an edge that felt less like routine procedure and more like a personal vendetta. She'd encountered this kind of hostility before, and while it was never easy, she had learned how to endure it. Carter continued pressing, his questions taking on an accusatory tone that veered far from standard protocol. He began listing supposed infractions that made little sense, his frustration evident as she kept responding calmly, giving him nothing to latch onto. Each accusation felt like a slap, each baseless claim designed to unnerve her, but Diana maintained her poise, her voice never faltering. As he continued, she weighed her options. The badge in her bag could stop this in an instant. With one glance at her FBI credentials, he'd have to think twice before overstepping his bounds. But would that solve the problem, or merely complicate it further? Revealing her position might shift his hostility into a dangerous blend of resentment and forced deference, a volatile combination that could spiral out of control. She hesitated, trying to gauge if showing her badge would escalate the situation or diffuse it. But when Carter started questioning her more aggressively, insinuating she was hiding something, Diana had enough. She reached into her bag, her movements deliberate, giving him no reason to overreact. The rain poured down harder, each droplet a reminder of the weight of the moment. Finally, she held her badge up, letting him see it in full view. The sight of it stopped him cold. His mouth parted slightly, the confidence draining from his expression as he took in the reality of who he was dealing with. The words, Federal Bureau of Investigation, stared back at him, and for a moment he seemed to struggle with what to say. He blinked, his grip on her documents tightening, as though they were an anchor grounding him in the face of his own error. Diana didn't say a word. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady and unwavering, letting the silence speak for itself. The rain continued to beat down, masking the stillness that had fallen between them as he realized the gravity of his mistake. He took a small, involuntary step back, the weight of his actions settling in. In that instant, she could see the layers of his prejudice peeling away, exposing the discomfort he felt in the wake of his assumptions. As the silence stretched on, the power dynamic shifted. Diana's quiet resolve left him standing there, drenched and uncertain, a stark contrast to the confidence he'd displayed moments before. The authority he had tried to wield over her was now a burden he could no longer hide behind. The rain fell harder, as if the storm itself sensed the tension lingering in the air. Diana held her FBI badge in her hand, its polished surface catching the faint glow from the police cruiser's headlights. She kept her gaze fixed on Officer Carter, watching him as he tried to process the revelation. His posture had stiffened, his once confident stance now faltering. His initial arrogance had withered into something between shock and discomfort, a clear sign that his conscience was starting to grasp the gravity of his actions. The storm around them seemed quieter than the silence they shared, an unspoken confrontation that carried its own intensity. Diana took a deep breath, feeling the exhaustion of the day mixing with the anger simmering within her. She hadn't wanted this encounter to escalate, hadn't wanted it to become a moment of forced reckoning. But now that they were here, she knew she couldn't let him off easily. This was more than just about her, it was about a system of biases that seemed to flourish unchecked in officers like him, and she wasn't about to let him walk away from this moment without understanding the consequences of his actions. Her voice, though calm, held a firmness that cut through the rain. "Do you realize what you've done here tonight, Officer Carter?" Her words weren't loud, but they held weight, each syllable challenging him to face the truth of his behavior. Carter's eyes darted around as if searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to run from this confrontation. His attempt to respond with a dismissive shrug faltered, and he looked back at her, a hint of defiance still lingering in his eyes. "I was just doing my job," he replied, his voice defensive. But even he didn't seem fully convinced by his own words. "Your job?" Diana's eyebrows lifted slightly, a subtle challenge in her expression. "Does your job involve harassing citizens based on a gut feeling? Or does it involve judging people before you even know their story?" She watched as Carter's defiance waned further. Her words, layered with experience and authority, hit him harder than he had expected. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides as he tried to regain his composure, but it was clear that her words had struck a nerve. She could see him grappling with the discomfort, wrestling with the realization that his behavior had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "Maybe you should think about why you felt so comfortable approaching me with that kind of hostility," she continued, her gaze never wavering. "Maybe you should ask yourself why you assumed I was up to something, or why you felt you had the right to intimidate me simply because I looked different than you." Carter didn't respond. The rain poured down between them, an almost poetic backdrop to the confrontation that was stripping away the layers of his authority. His uniform, his badge, his status, they all seemed insignificant now, overshadowed by the raw honesty in Diana's words. Finally, he looked down, unable to meet her gaze any longer. The defiance in his expression had faded completely, replaced by something that looked like shame. He shuffled his feet, his shoulders slumping as the weight of her words settled over him. Diana allowed the silence to stretch, letting him sit in the discomfort of the moment, giving him the space to truly absorb the impact of his actions. Diana knew this was just one encounter, one instance in a much larger pattern, but she also knew that this moment could be a turning point for both of them. She had taken a stand, and now it was up to Carter to decide whether he would let this experience change him. The storm raged on through the night, but Diana's resolve remained as steady as ever. The next morning, Officer Carter's alarm blared, jarring him awake from a restless night. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the memory of his encounter with Diana Lewis. He couldn't shake the image of her calm, piercing gaze, the way she had looked at him with a mix of disappointment and challenge. It had unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected, and now, in the harsh light of day, the reality of his actions felt even heavier. He got up, moving through his morning routine with a sense of dread. Each step seemed to take more effort, as though he were trudging through the weight of his own conscience. By the time he reached the station, the usual chatter among his colleagues sounded distant, their laughter and casual conversations starkly contrasting with the turmoil churning inside him. As he made his way to his desk, he noticed several officers glancing his way, their expressions unreadable. The station had an unmistakable air of tension, and Carter quickly realized that news of last night's encounter had already begun to spread. Rumors had a way of moving swiftly through the ranks, and it was clear that his actions were now the topic of hushed conversations. Before he could settle into his chair, he was summoned to the chief's office. The walk down the narrow hallway felt longer than usual, each step echoing with the mounting anticipation of what was to come. When he entered the office, he found his chief sitting behind his desk, a stack of papers in front of him, and a grave expression on his face. "Carter, sit down," the chief said, his tone devoid of its usual familiarity. Carter obeyed, sinking into the chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he waited for the inevitable reprimand. The chief looked at him, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "I've been briefed on the incident from last night. Do you realize the seriousness of this situation?" Carter opened his mouth to respond, but the chief held up a hand, silencing him. "You're not going to explain this away. We've had too many complaints, too many accusations of similar behavior, and now you've managed to target an FBI agent." His voice was laced with disappointment and frustration, each word a blow to Carter's pride. "Effective immediately. You are suspended, pending an investigation. There will be a formal review, and you should consider this a final warning, Carter. If the investigation finds any further evidence of misconduct, you can expect more severe consequences." The chief's gaze softened for a moment, but there was no sympathy in his eyes, only the cold, hard truth of accountability. Carter sat there, numb, as the reality of his suspension sank in. He'd known there would be consequences, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. The chief dismissed him, and as Carter made his way back through the station, he could feel the stares of his colleagues, a mix of pity, judgment, and quiet relief that they weren't the ones in his position. Returning home, he sat alone in his apartment, replaying the events in his mind. The pride he had once taken in his badge now felt hollow, replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt and regret. Diana's words echoed in his head, her questions cutting through his defenses like a blade. He'd prided himself on his commitment to the law, to justice, but now he was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that he had let his own biases dictate his actions. In the silence of his empty apartment, Carter was left with nothing but his own thoughts. The suspension was just the beginning, an outward consequence of a deeper, more personal reckoning. He realized that this moment would follow him for the rest of his life, a turning point that demanded he either confront his flaws or risk falling deeper into a cycle of bitterness and resentment. But as the hours ticked by, Carter found himself grappling with a question that went beyond his career, beyond the walls of the police station. It was a question that reached into the core of who he was and the kind of person he wanted to become. And though he didn't yet know the answer, he understood that his future would be shaped by how he chose to respond in the days ahead. Alone in his apartment, Carter felt a silence heavier than anything he had ever known. The usual sounds of the street below, the distant hum of traffic, and even the soft ticking of the clock on his wall seemed to fade into a muted backdrop. He sat on his couch, staring blankly at the badge lying on the coffee table in front of him. It was the same badge he had once viewed with pride, a symbol of authority, duty, and respect. But now, it felt more like a weight he couldn't lift, its metallic gleam a harsh reminder of everything he'd taken for granted. Carter's mind spun, reliving the events of the past night over and over, each detail clearer and more painful than before. He remembered the look in Diana's eyes, a look that hadn't been one of anger, but rather disappointment. She hadn't raised her voice or responded with aggression. She'd simply laid bare the flaws in his actions with a calm, unshakable conviction that had left him defenseless. Her words echoed within him, each one challenging the beliefs he'd once held about himself and his role as an officer. He'd spent his career defining himself by a code of justice, a code that seemed black and white in his mind, right and wrong, law and order. But now, for the first time, he was forced to confront the gray areas he'd ignored, the biases he'd allowed to cloud his judgment, the ways he'd let his own assumptions affect the people he had sworn to protect. How many others had he treated this way? How many times had he let his own prejudices dictate his behavior without ever stopping to question them? Carter's hands tightened into fists as he fought the wave of shame rising within him. The words he'd spoken to Diana, the accusations he'd thrown at her, they hadn't been based on anything more than a feeling, a gut reaction he'd never bothered to examine. And the worst part was, he'd never thought he needed to. He'd assumed that his badge gave him an innate sense of authority, a right to decide who was trustworthy and who was not. But now, he saw how deeply flawed that assumption had been. It wasn't authority he'd wielded, it was bias, unchecked and unexamined. The suspension had been a jolt, but the real reckoning was happening now, in the quiet of his own mind. He'd thought of himself as a protector of the law, as someone who was above the prejudices and pettiness he'd seen in others. But Diana's words had peeled back the layers of his self-image, revealing the uncomfortable truth. He was just as susceptible to prejudice as anyone else, and perhaps even more so because he had never questioned it. As night turned to early morning, Carter felt a growing urgency to change. He didn't know where to begin, but he understood that if he didn't address these flaws within himself, he would never be able to move forward. He could no longer hide behind his badge or use his authority as a shield. This moment demanded something deeper, a willingness to face himself fully, flaws and all. But how did someone begin to dismantle years of ingrained prejudice? The realization was overwhelming, and yet it felt like the first true step he had taken toward understanding himself. For hours, he sat in that silence, his mind unraveling each layer, each assumption, each moment he'd overlooked or brushed aside. The journey ahead seemed daunting, but he knew that if he didn't commit to it, he would be forever haunted by the look in Diana's eyes and the truth her words had revealed. Across town, Diana was back in her office, but something about her usual routine felt different. Her encounter with Officer Carter lingered in her mind, a reminder of the unyielding challenges she faced daily. She had worked hard to earn her position, breaking through barriers and overcoming countless instances of prejudice and doubt. But last night's experience wasn't just another encounter, it was a stark reminder of the work that remained to be done. As an FBI agent, Diana had always approached her cases with a sense of responsibility and justice, driven by the belief that her work could bring about real change. But she knew that change wasn't limited to catching criminals or solving cases. It extended into the very systems she worked within. Her experience with Carter had reignited her commitment to advocating for reform, for addressing the biases that ran deep within law enforcement. She knew firsthand the impact of these biases, and she was determined to use her position to challenge and dismantle them. Diana opened her laptop and began drafting a proposal for a new training initiative within her department. She wanted to address implicit bias, to create programs that would help agents and officers alike confront and recognize their own prejudices. The process was slow, her thoughts flowing as she considered every detail, every potential obstacle. She knew that resistance was inevitable. There would be those who saw such initiatives as unnecessary or overly critical, but she also knew that if change was to happen, it needed to start from within. As she typed, Diana recalled the countless stories of friends, family members, and even strangers who had shared similar experiences of discrimination at the hands of law enforcement. Her encounter with Carter had been a reminder of their stories, of the deep-rooted pain and frustration that often went unacknowledged. It wasn't enough for her to simply recognize the problem. She had to act. She had to channel her experiences, her understanding, into tangible change. Throughout the day, she poured herself into her work, fueled by a resolve she hadn't felt in a long time. She reached out to colleagues she knew shared her vision, connecting with agents who had faced similar struggles, who understood the importance of addressing these issues openly. Together, they began discussing ways to implement programs that would educate officers on cultural awareness, sensitivity, and implicit bias, focusing not only on changing behavior, but also on fostering empathy and understanding. For Diana, this wasn't just a professional endeavor. It was personal. Her commitment to reform wasn't about making life easier for herself. It was about creating a future where people like her, people like the countless others who had experienced injustice, could move through the world without fear, without suspicion. She wanted to build a system that valued accountability and fairness, that encouraged officers to serve their communities with integrity and respect. As the day turned into evening, Diana felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, that the changes she sought wouldn't happen overnight. But she was ready to face the challenges, fueled by the belief that her work could create a lasting impact. Her encounter with Carter had reminded her of the power of her voice, of the influence she could wield when she stood up for what was right. In her heart, Diana carried the hope that people like Carter could change, that the confrontation they'd shared could serve as a turning point not only for him, but for others like him. She understood that transformation wasn't easy, that it demanded honesty and humility, but she also believed in the potential for growth, in the possibility of people rising above their own limitations to become better versions of themselves. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, Diana resolved to keep pushing forward, to keep challenging the status quo. She knew that the journey would be long and that there would be setbacks along the way. But she was ready, armed with her experiences and her commitment to justice, to face whatever lay ahead. In her mind, she knew that every step she took, every effort she made, would be one more step toward a world where people were judged not by the color of their skin, but by the strength of their character. Carter stood at the edge of a crossroads, staring down two distinct paths that stretched out before him, each demanding a different version of himself. On one side was the familiar, the easy route, a road paved with defensiveness and resentment. He could choose to ignore the sting of Diana's words, brush off the shame, and retreat into bitterness. He could keep his walls up, view himself as the victim, and blame her, the system, and everyone else but himself. This path was well-worn, marked by denial, justifications, and the weight of pride. He knew it well. He'd seen others walk it before, seen officers he respected harden over time, each encounter leaving them more jaded, more unyielding, until they saw every interaction through a veil of suspicion and distrust. But the other path, this was uncharted territory, a daunting road full of uncertainty. Choosing it meant embracing responsibility, opening himself up to the possibility of growth, and committing to dismantling the biases that had defined his actions. It was a path of humility and self-reflection, one that required him to set aside his defenses and acknowledge the uncomfortable truths he had been avoiding for so long. This path would demand more than just an apology or a temporary adjustment in behavior. It would require him to rebuild himself from the ground up, to examine every thought, every instinct, and every belief that had shaped him as a person and as an officer. Carter sat alone in his apartment, staring at his reflection in the window, the city lights casting faint shadows across his face. The weight of his decision loomed large, and he could feel the struggle playing out within him. Part of him resisted, clinging to the identity he had spent years building, an identity rooted in authority, control, and an unwavering belief in his own righteousness. But another part of him, the part that couldn't shake the look in Diana's eyes, the part that recognized the truth in her words, knew that if he didn't change, he would spend the rest of his life living in the shadow of his mistakes. The next few days passed in a haze. Suspended from the force, he was forced to confront the emptiness that had been lurking beneath the surface of his life, an emptiness he had ignored for years by burying himself in work. Without the routine, the authority, and the identity that his badge provided, he felt adrift, stripped down to the core of who he was without the armor of his uniform to shield him. He wandered through his apartment, the silence pressing in on him, each moment forcing him to face the uncomfortable truth that he had defined himself by his role rather than his values. Carter's mind drifted back to his early days on the force, to the idealism that had once driven him to become an officer. He remembered the sense of purpose he had felt, the desire to protect and serve, to make a difference in his community. But somewhere along the way, that purpose had eroded, replaced by cynicism and a sense of entitlement. He had become someone who saw authority as a right rather than a responsibility, someone who had forgotten that his badge was meant to serve people, not control them. The realization was painful, each memory like a wound reopening, but he forced himself to face it, knowing that he couldn't move forward without confronting his past. In an attempt to understand more, Carter began reading about implicit bias, something he had once dismissed as an overblown concept. The more he read, the more he realized how deeply ingrained these biases were, how they operated in subtle ways that often went unnoticed but shaped his actions and decisions nonetheless. He learned about how experiences, media portrayals, and even casual conversations had subtly influenced his perceptions over the years, creating a lens through which he viewed others without even realizing it. This knowledge unsettled him, challenging the foundation of his beliefs, but it also opened his eyes to a new perspective, a perspective that made him question everything he thought he knew. One evening, unable to shake the need for reflection, he reached out to a former mentor, a retired officer who had once guided him during his early years on the force. They met at a quiet coffee shop, and Carter felt a sense of relief wash over him as he sat across from the older man, someone who had seen the best and worst of him over the years. He opened up about his recent experiences, about the suspension, the confrontation with Diana, and the internal struggle that had consumed him ever since. The mentor listened quietly, his face lined with years of experience, his expression thoughtful. When Carter finished, he spoke with a calm yet steady voice, words laced with hard-earned wisdom. "Liam, you've reached a point that every officer will face at some point," he began. "You can either let the job harden you, close yourself off, or you can use it to grow. The choice is yours, but one path will make you a better man, and the other will only drag you down." Carter nodded, feeling the weight of his mentor's words. He realized that this wasn't just about one mistake or one encounter. It was about the kind of person he wanted to be, the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. He could either continue down the path of bitterness and denial, or choose the harder, more painful path of growth and accountability. The decision was his alone, but he knew that his choice would shape not only his career, but his sense of integrity. As the days turned into weeks, Carter began to take small steps down this new path. He attended workshops on cultural competency and bias awareness, programs he had once dismissed as unnecessary or irrelevant. He listened to stories from people who had experienced discrimination, hearing perspectives that he had never truly considered before. Each story was a reminder of the impact his actions could have, a reminder that his role as an officer wasn't just about enforcing the law, but about fostering trust and respect within the community. He began to reach out to colleagues who had also faced moments of reckoning, officers who had learned from their own mistakes and had chosen to grow rather than retreat. Through their conversations, he found a sense of solidarity and understanding, a shared commitment to becoming better, to challenging the biases they had once ignored. Together, they formed a small but dedicated group within the force, a group committed to accountability and self-improvement, a group that believed in the power of change. But Carter knew that his journey wasn't over. The path he had chosen would require constant vigilance, a willingness to examine himself continuously, to remain open to growth even when it was uncomfortable. He understood that this wasn't about redemption. It was about responsibility, about making amends for the harm he had caused and striving to prevent future mistakes. Late one night, as he sat alone in his apartment, he found himself thinking of Diana again. He wondered if she knew the impact she had made, if she realized that her courage in confronting him had set him on a path he might never have considered otherwise. He felt a deep sense of gratitude toward her, a respect that went beyond their encounter, for she had given him a gift, a chance to become a better person, to redefine his legacy. Carter knew he couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the pain he had caused or the mistakes he had made. But he could take responsibility for his actions, he could learn, and he could grow. And as he looked down the long road ahead, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to becoming the kind of officer and the kind of man who lived up to the ideals he had once believed in. He didn't know where this path would ultimately lead him, but he knew one thing for certain. He was ready to walk it, to embrace the hard work of transformation, and to dedicate himself to a future defined not by his mistakes, but by his willingness to learn from them. In the weeks and months that followed, the ripple effects of the encounter between Diana and Carter began to spread throughout the community, the police department, and beyond. The incident had sparked conversations that reached far beyond the two of them, igniting discussions on accountability, systemic bias, and the profound need for reform. It was as if their meeting had torn a small opening in a larger wall, revealing the fractures in the system and giving others the courage to examine those cracks more closely. At the police department, word of Carter's suspension and subsequent investigation became a catalyst for reflection among the officers. For some, it served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that authority was a privilege that required humility, not a right to be wielded carelessly. The leadership, initially reluctant to address the deeper issues exposed by the incident, found itself under pressure as calls for change grew louder. Diana's resolve had struck a chord, and now officers, civilians, and even members of local government were demanding more comprehensive training programs, accountability measures, and open dialogues to address the biases that had long been overlooked. In response, the department launched a series of initiatives aimed at fostering transparency and trust within the community. Implicit bias training became mandatory for all officers, including senior staff who had previously resisted such measures. This wasn't just a surface-level change. It was the beginning of a cultural shift that encouraged officers to examine their assumptions, to approach their duties with empathy, and to recognize the impact their actions had on the people they served. Carter, meanwhile, found himself at the heart of this transformation. No longer the defensive, self-assured officer he had once been, he became a student of change, actively participating in the very programs that he had once scoffed at. He showed up to every training session, every discussion, every workshop with a sense of humility that surprised his colleagues. He listened to stories from community members who shared their own experiences of discrimination and prejudice, each story a reminder of the harm he had once caused. He began working with community leaders, joining efforts to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they were meant to protect. One afternoon, Carter was invited to speak at a town hall meeting, a gathering organized to address the community's concerns about policing and to open up a dialogue between citizens and the officers who served them. As he took the stage, he looked out over the faces of people he had once viewed with indifference, and he felt the weight of his responsibility settle over him. "I won't pretend to have all the answers," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I won't ask for forgiveness for my mistakes. What I can promise you is that I am committed to doing better, to listening, and to understanding the experiences of each and every person here. I know now that a badge doesn't make me immune to prejudice. It doesn't give me the right to judge or assume. It gives me the duty to serve with integrity, respect, and humility." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Some people looked at him with skepticism, others with cautious hope, but Carter wasn't asking for their acceptance. He was asking for their trust that he would continue to hold himself accountable. He knew that his transformation was far from complete and that earning back the community's respect would be a long journey. Across town, Diana's work was also making waves. Her advocacy for systemic reform within law enforcement had taken on new momentum, fueled by the widespread impact of her encounter with Carter. She was invited to speak at various forums, sharing her experiences as both an FBI agent and a woman of color navigating a world often tinged with bias and discrimination. She used her platform to shine a light on the invisible barriers that people faced, barriers that were often overlooked or ignored by those in positions of power. Diana's proposals for reform gained traction, leading to pilot programs in several departments across the state. She pushed for accountability measures that would create transparency within law enforcement, programs that would allow citizens to report incidents of misconduct without fear of retaliation. She advocated for mentorship programs that would pair experienced officers with new recruits, fostering a culture of respect and empathy from the very start. Her work was reshaping the way people thought about policing, not as a monolithic force, but as a collection of individuals committed to the community. Over time, the community began to change as well. Conversations about race, authority, and privilege became part of the fabric of daily life. People felt more comfortable voicing their concerns, sharing their stories, and participating in discussions that had once been considered taboo. There were still moments of tension, still disagreements and frustrations, but there was also a newfound sense of understanding, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and a commitment to move forward together. For Carter, this journey of transformation was deeply personal. Each day was a reminder of the person he had once been and the person he was striving to become. There were moments when he doubted himself, times when he wondered if he was truly capable of change, if he could ever make up for the harm he had caused. But in those moments, he reminded himself of the reasons he had chosen this path, of the commitment he had made to himself and to the community. One evening, as he walked through a local park, he was approached by a young man who recognized him from the town hall meeting. The man looked hesitant, but after a moment, he extended his hand. "I just wanted to say, I didn't think people could change," the young man said, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and hope. "But seeing you up there, hearing you speak, it made me think that maybe we all can." Carter shook the man's hand, feeling a surge of gratitude and humility. "Thank you," he replied softly. "I'm just trying to do what's right. We all have a long way to go." The interaction, small as it was, filled him with a sense of purpose. It reminded him that change wasn't about perfection. It was about progress, about the willingness to face one's mistakes and to work tirelessly to become better. He knew he would continue to face challenges, that there would be days when the old habits, the old biases, would resurface. But he was committed to the path he had chosen, a path that was now defined by accountability, empathy, and a deep respect for the community he served. As for Diana, she watched these changes with a quiet sense of fulfillment. She knew that her work was far from over, that the road to true systemic reform was long and winding. But seeing the impact of her actions, seeing people like Carter genuinely striving to be better, gave her hope. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage and conviction could create ripples that spread far beyond what one person might ever imagine. Diana and Carter's paths crossed a few more times over the years, their interactions respectful and marked by a shared understanding of the journey they had both undertaken. There was no need for apologies or forgiveness between them. They each understood the role the other had played in their personal transformations. They had become, in a way, unlikely allies in the ongoing fight for justice and accountability. In the end, the impact of that single rainy night extended far beyond the two of them. It became a story that was shared within the community, a story that inspired others to confront their own biases, to question their assumptions, and to choose the harder, braver path of self-reflection. It was a story of reckoning, redemption, and the power of choice, a reminder that while the road to change was long and often difficult, it was a journey worth taking. And as the years passed, both Diana and Carter continued to walk that road, each step a testament to their commitment to growth, understanding, and the unyielding belief that real change was not only possible, but essential. Their story became a part of the community's legacy, a reminder of the strength that lay within the power of accountability and the courage to confront one's own flaws. In the end, their journey was far from over, but they had already taken the most important step. They had chosen to walk the path of change, no matter how long or challenging it might be. And in doing so, they had planted the seeds of a future where justice, empathy, and understanding would one day flourish, not just for them, but for generations to come.